listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
Welcome back into the Psych with Mike library. This is take 2 for this episode.
We'll get it right eventually.
And I am here with Mr. Brett Newcomb. Hello, Mr. Brett.
How are you doing?
And if people are watching us, then they know that we have a third person in the studio today.
Yes.
And if you are listening on the podcast, we have a third person in the studio today.
And there she is.
Hello.
Her name is Molly Eames, and she's going to tell us a little bit about who she is and what she does.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful. As I said, my name is Molly, and I am a sexuality educator and wellness consultant here in St. Louis. I believe in education to empowerment, and I really love helping women and couples find their sexual self and to have an increase in intimacy in your relationship and just to be better. I really think that holistically as a person, sexuality is such a huge part of us. And when that part is not confident and doing well, it makes sense to me that maybe other aspects of our life are not congruent and falling apart. And so I think it's really important that we tap into our sexual self and have a better understanding of it, and it helps us be better people.
So when you say sexuality, then what does that mean for you? And what does that mean for the work that you do?
Sure. So when I talk about sexuality, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm a sex educator. Mm-hmm. And I really like the word sexuality because often when people hear the word sex, they think, oh, well, we're talking about vagina, penis, and penetration. But when I hear sex and sexuality, I'm thinking about self-image and communication skills and how do you identify, how do you express yourself. I'm looking at larger things outside of just an act.
And that's exactly what I think of, and Brett and I have talked about issues of sexuality but also intimacy on the podcast before, and I think that there's a big difference between sexuality and even intimacy. I think they go together, but I don't think they're the same thing. Would you agree with that?
I would, absolutely, because you can have multiple different kinds of intimacy, right?
Right.
And intimacy is just that closeness, that feeling of closeness about things. You can have emotional intimacy and physical and intellectual. So yeah, it definitely, I think that intimacy goes with sexuality. They don't have to be, together.
Right, right.
It's not synonymous terms.
Correct.
There are layers of intimacy.
Well, and we've talked about the intimacy aspect before, and my belief that, intimate relationships are really relationships based on trust, honesty, and empathy, and that is what makes an intimate relationship, which doesn't have anything to do with being sexual. It can, and intimate relationships can be sexual, but don't have to be. But then you have sexual relationships, and what I'm hearing you say, Molly, is that a sexual relationship can be intercourse, but doesn't have to be.
Correct.
Yeah. So what would be involved in a sexual relationship that isn't intercourse? Because I think people get hung up on that.
Of course. Man, there's so much, right? I mean, sexuality exists on this beautiful continuum from mild to wild, and not everything there is penetration. There is so much to experience from just touching and experiencing different kinds of touch, from words and listening to kind things being said to you. Closeness can be being held. And exploring what that means to you, and exploring pleasure. When I always like to ask my clients and think about this. How do you define sex? And more often than not, they're like, penetration is sex. Well, no, it's, sex is not about orgasm. Sex is not about penetration. It's about following pleasure and experiencing it in a variety of different ways. And so you can experience that sexuality and that moment without having it be vagina penis.
And one of the things that I have always said when I talk to clients about sex is that and really even emotional intimacy, is that in my experience, women tend, and this is a blanket statement and so obviously isn't 100% universally appropriate, but women tend to require or like emotional intimacy before they have sexual intercourse. Men tend to prefer sexual intercourse to be open to emotional intimacy. Would you agree with that, disagree with that, amend that in some way?
Well, yeah, and I think that what's missing in that context is the talk of arousal and desire. And oftentimes for women, we need that emotional intimacy in order to feel that arousal and desire. And that's what gets us lubricated and ready for
So you think that's
moment.
physiological or cultural?
both.
Okay. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Well, and I know that one of the things that we were, had talked about is how does sexuality and this concept change as we age, and I think physiologically that's really important. As we talk about desire, so I was at an event last night and we were talking about this. So spontaneous desire, that moment when you see somebody and you're just like, yes, this is happening, let's do it. It really only happens in less than 20% of women. That's staggering, right?
Yeah.
Because culturally, we think that should be the norm.
But I think culturally that women are repressed from feeling that or expressing that.
Well, there's a double standard, for sure, of
All right,
shame.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's where I want you to go.
Okay, but then if you're quoting that statistic, so is that statistic based on biology or sociology?
Well, it's saying that you're going to experience as a female spontaneous desire probably in your adolescence, Anywhere, that's really the time when hormones are at their optimal, everything is flushing, and it's going to change as we age, all right? And then there's responsive desire, which is that more of that feeling of we sometimes have to get ourselves in the mood to be open to this. And that's about learning what kind of touch do you like? How do you get in the mood? Because as we age, that's going to be more important for us to understand, because we won't just be able to look at somebody and be like, yes.
When we see a lot of, especially as our population ages in the United States, we see a lot of people in nursing homes where the issue is touch deprivation.
Yes.
They don't have somebody that will just touch them and stroke them, not in a classic sexual penetration sense, but in a communicating, connecting, intimacy sense. They also have, in some of the more modern old folks' homes, they have togetherness rooms where couples can go in a room and have sex, if that's where they can go, or whatever they can do. And sometimes physiologically their systems are broken down enough that they can't have classically understood sexual release, but they can still go in a room and touch each other, kiss each other, whatever they might be able to do.
Touch
and it's
is
good
so
for them.
important.
It helps them.
Touch is so important. I mean, if you think about it, touching as a baby is really important for their development. And tactile touch as we age is also, as you stated, incredibly important, and something that, I think that we treat our elderly pretty horribly here.
Well, most of those places are body storage facilities. We just park you here till you die.
Right.
And it's really...
We'll feed you and water you, but that's all we're going to do.
Yeah, it's so sad because, as I said, sexuality is such an important part of our life. I can't even imagine being later on and feeling like that was denied for me.
So we don't have a lot of time today. I'd like to get in a couple of other areas as well. Thinking back over doing 35 years of therapy with individuals and couples, one of the consistent themes that I've encountered is the issue of communication between a couple in terms of things they want, things they desire, things they will permit, things they're willing to do, not as a matter of leverage, not as a matter of blackmail or force, but as a matter of, I care about you and I'm willing to explore these behaviors with you, but you need to let me know what you want.
Yes.
And then hopefully I'm in a position to say, I don't want that, I don't have any interest in that, or I hadn't thought about that, but I'm willing to look at it. What do you teach people about that communication component?
Communication is the backbone to everything, particularly when it comes to sex. And there are basic communication skills that you need to know. You need to know how to say yes. you need to know how to say no and to be really okay with it.
If your body just locks up, that is a way to say no, but that's not necessarily the best way to say no.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to be verbal.
Yeah.
And sometimes that...
Use your words. Every
Yes.
elementary teacher in the world.
It's
Yeah.
so true. And it's really hard sometimes for women because we're not taught that. We're not taught to be assured and say no.
Well, sometimes it changes. Your mood changes. And so last week you were okay with this. This week you're not okay with this. What does that mean to me? Did I do something wrong? Am I to be offended or hurt? Or am I just being gentle and supportive?
Right.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that occurs to me in this conversation is that in my experience, and I hear what you guys are talking about with saying no, but what I oftentimes encounter are that people don't know how to say yes.
That's
Yeah.
so true.
Sometimes they say yes, and then later they say, I did that for you because
Right.
you have to do this for me.
Right, and right. So there's a contingent
Yes.
but there's also this. I don't know how to be able to be open. I think that, and I don't know if it's that people feel like that if I say yes, it makes me vulnerable, or what the hang up is. But that's what I hear. I very rarely. I'm not saying I've never heard this, but I very rarely, when couples come in and they talk about sexual concerns, I've almost never heard anybody say that there's one partner who is absolutely not going to have sex, right? They're saying, no, we want this to be a part of our lives. We don't know how to make it a part of our lives in a way that feels good and satisfying for both individuals.
Which is the question of intimacy, the safety to explore wherever those boundaries are. You get somebody that has a sexual trauma history, and maybe they're anorgasmic, and you have to figure out, are they anorgasmic because they don't have enough testosterone to have a libido, or do you figure out they're anorgasmic because they were tortured as a child and they can never relax their vigilance enough to experience what their body is saying. 20-30% of the women say they've never had an orgasm.
Right.
So, and so then, is that a failure on the man's part because his technique and skill are not sufficient to the day, or what is that?
First and foremost, who do you think whose job is it to make sure that you are pleased during an intimate moment?
It should be the individual's job.
Yes.
Yeah,
It is
absolutely.
up to you. It is not your partner's job to please you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I don't think that people feel comfortable being able to believe
You'll be able to
that.
say, "Where are you going? I'm not finished."
But
Yeah.
right.
Come back here. I don't care if the ball game's on.
One thing though that I would like to ask Molly is that does this go back to your original question, which was is the 20% of women who don't have orgasm, is that biology or is that sociology?
It's some of each, and you have to figure out what it is. And sometimes you do that with medical explorations and do a blood test and measure, because you got to have a certain amount of testosterone. It's not going to work.
Right. So go ahead and tell people where you get that information from.
Well, I get that information from 2 books that I've written, which just
well,
happen
I'm
to
not.
have a-
I'm not. You can push the books, but I'm just saying that Brett actually has a tremendous amount of experience and expertise working with Dr. Kathy Maupin here in St.
Absolutely.
Louis,
Yes.
who is a bioidentical hormone replacement specialist, and she has been on the forefront of that. And you guys have done a lot of research that's gone into 2 books that you've published, and that's one of the things that you guys talk about a lot is that what's the difference between the biology of that and the sociology of especially the ability for partners, whether they are male or female, to be able to engage in and enjoy sexual relations.
That's a conversation we just had. We also, in addition to writing those books, we do a podcast every week. We have 465 episodes in the tank.
You're just rubbing that in.
And we had one this week, a conversation about how patients and doctors need to be able to talk about orgasm.
Yes.
And the ability to have an orgasm, and where might the limitations be, and what might be the cause of those limitations, and what kinds of things, whether it's a referral to a sex educator or a sex therapist or a regular counselor or whomever, where's the blockage that's making that not happen?
Right.
And it's fascinating.
Well, one of the things I talk about with everyone is I am a huge proponent of mindfulness. And I think that's where mindfulness really can come into play here of, mindfulness is really just about being acutely aware in the present moment without judgment. And that can be very difficult.
No, say that again, because I want people to hear that.
Mindfulness is being acutely aware in the present moment without holding judgment. And that judgment part is really, really important.
Absolutely.
A lot of people, when we start talking about mindfulness.
Not judging your partner, but not also judging yourself.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, when you practice mindfulness, the amount of self-love and forgiveness you have is incredible. And that translates into your sex life. It translates into feeling the ability to be open sexually, to receive pleasure, to give pleasure, to be in the moment and not cluttered, have your brain cluttered with the to-do list and did I pick up my kid? Oh my gosh, I have laundry. But to really be in the moment and not be thinking, okay, does my butt look okay? But those are the things that we all think about. So I always love talking about mindfulness with us.
And women are more likely to be thinking in those sexualized moments, did I unload the dishwasher? Has the laundry stopped running? Did I get the kids' lunch packed? Men are typically not going to be thinking about those things. Some men may and do, but typically...
You looked at me
when
when you said that.
I know how you are about keeping a clean house. So you get sexual stereotypes that you have to educate about or have to teach understanding about so that we can come together and communicate.
Yes.
So, it's like the love languages and say, what is your way of attempting to say to me, I love you, I want you? And am I hearing you on the right channel? Because I may be on the other channel.
Totally.
And so you have to teach people sensitivity and awareness, and then you have to teach them a capacity to reach across channels.
Okay, so now I got to ask this question. So then how do you say to a couple, because that's all about communication, right? How do you help a couple have exactly that conversation to be open to saying what you want? And
so the key, I would say, and I want your answer, is the whole thing you just said about mindfulness and judgmentalness. As the person who's the interventionist, you can't be judgmental for or against either one or whatever their prescription is. So you have to invite them to express it and then teach them how to communicate about it.
Absolutely.
Would you say that?
I would completely echo that. And it's really helping them, give them the language to use.
Yes.
I loved what you were talking about. It's one of my favorite activities, that worksheet of where, I'm willing to do this, to receive this and to give this. And it goes through, the worksheet I use, I think, is 10 pages long. Wow. But
I don't know that much about sex. Could I have one?
But you might if you go work with her.
We deal with many things, but it's really eye-opening because many people just think that sex or intimacy looks one way. But we talk about with touch, it's temperature, texture, light touch versus hard touch.
Right.
Explore that with your partner, on their body and what do you like and really being open to that. And it's a beautiful thing to do with couples because often they don't think about it. They're like, well, gosh, I don't think I've ever, kind of nibbled on my partner before.
But what if
he
there's
may like that.
Right? What if there's resistance? What if people are resistant to allowing themselves to have that conversation?
Before we even get to this stage, there is so much conversation about how did you learn about sex? How did you learn about sexuality? What is your experience? Because we have typically a lot of shame to uncover. Loads of shame that come from our families, from our friends, from culture, from films. My
wife and I were watching a TV show last night. It was filmed in Britain. And the two male characters went to the bathroom, and there were a row of maybe 10 open urinals, no dividers in between. And one guy who went in first went to the middle urinal. The guy who came in second walked right up next to him. And I started laughing, and Phyllis asked me, "What are you laughing at?" And I said, "Men would not do that."
In America, men would not do that.
Right.
Exactly. They leave at least one open slot if there is one. You're not going to go up next to some guy unless there's no other room. And she's like, I didn't know that about guys. I said, oh, guys are very much that way. So those kinds of cultural perceptions are so ingrained in us, and we don't necessarily know that we have them unless somebody asks a question or presents the stimulus.
Yes. Yeah, and it's why I really feel everyone should be talking about this. I think we do such a disservice by not normalizing this conversation on the home front, whether it's with your partner, with your friends, with your kids. As I said, I'm a step parent. I talk about this with my kids all the time because I think it's really important. I want them to be healthy. I don't want them to be hung up on things or to have severe, crazy shame about it. You know, your body is beautiful. Your love is beautiful. That's what we should be preaching.
But for me, the craziness of living in the United States is the way that the message about sex is so ambiguous. It's a double standard because, you know, a woman can go to a beach in a thong, completely almost uncovered, but then we have these repressed sexual ideas that are so ingrained in us that we might not even be aware. It's so amazing to me how prudential that we are, right? When we still, so photographically, we seem to be very liberal, but then attitudinal wise, we seem to be very prudential.
Well, but we market sex extensively,
Right,
but
right.
we market on the basis of objectifying women.
Yes.
Mm.
That
So
you have to be a certain
teach
type.
about objectification.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole thing about pornography. Do you teach your sons and your husbands that
Okay.
it objectifies women?
So are you saying that then that object is just that? It's a object separate from anybody that I know, and it isn't an obtainable. I mean, so you're saying that exists outside the realm of the prudential ideals?
I don't know. I don't know where the extent of
Yeah.
it is. I just think that objectification of sexual behaviors and sexuality for men or women, you know, all men are pond scum, all women are just, you know, whatever. I think that's part of the educational issue that we have to overcome.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not completely against pornography. And I have talked to, you know, my stepson about it, and it's an ongoing conversation with other people. Pornography is entertainment. That is first and foremost what we need to be telling people. It is entertainment. What you see is not real life. You know, you have no concept of how many outtakes and whatever is going on to, you know, create these films. But there is things that you can learn from it. And that's something kind of circling back to couples who are curious, like, okay, well, how do I bring intimacy to that next level? Sometimes pornography can show that to them, you know, in a different way.
So as a sex educator, you would then, and don't mean to put words in your mouth, so if this isn't correct, then please correct it. You would then tell people that it's okay for them to use pornography in their intimate relationship. That isn't necessarily an objectification. So a woman should not automatically assume that everything that has to do with pornography is evil.
Correct. 100%. And there is some amazing ethical porn that is female driven that is just incredible. And doesn't feel dirty or, you know, yucky or at all. It's really beautiful and it's really intimate, and they're real people engaging in real intimate acts. And that is what I would offer to couples to look at, not necessarily looking at
So
whatever you're finding
Do you
online.
Google ethical porn?
That's what I was going to say.
Google ethical porn. There are ethical porn lists, and a lot of it comes from Canada, weirdly enough, and you do have to pay for it, which also is the downside, and I know that's why many people go to Pornhub. But, you know, if you're really interested in that, there's an incredible market for it.
So can you send me that
Absolutely.
information, and I'll put that up with the show notes. And so what's the difference between what we would understand porn from, like Pornhub, and the ethical porn that you're talking about? What's the difference there?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, we're making sure that all the actors are of age and are consenting. We're not dealing with any of that part. We're discussing maybe perhaps it's more storyline driven instead of just this carnal urge.
Which is more likely to include some intimacy.
Yes, exactly. It's going to include foreplay. And foreplay that's not just fellatio, you know, and using props and toys. And it's going to be a little bit softer. And I think that's really what you're going to find. However, having said that, you can really find anything. And if you're more into kink and fetish, there are also ethical porn for that.
But you had said that this is female directed, so females are involved in the production, the story, and every aspect of the creation of it.
Yes. Which, provides a different view.
Absolutely.
Right? And for a lot of women, that is really appealing. That is what I want to see and watch with my partner. It is more erotic.
I think a lot of women would approach that more as science fiction.
Yeah. Yes.
So we're running a little bit long, but I'm okay with that because I think this is great, and when you have a third person in the conversation, that obviously includes an additional time. But I did want to ask you something. So I'm 55 years old.
Yes.
I've been in a committed relationship with a person, my wife, for over 32 years. We have 2 grown children, one of which is going to be leaving home at the end of this year, getting married, and so we're going to be empty nesting. And so we've talked a lot about this over the course. I actually brought this up about a year ago with my wife. We need to understand who we are as a couple outside of the context of raising kids, because we've never not done that. I mean, we got together, and before we were, old enough to know what was going on, we were having kids. So we've never been in a relationship where we weren't being parents. And this year was the first time that we actually have traveled without our children. So we went to Jamaica just by ourselves.
Good for you.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
It was amazing. It was fantastic. But obviously, I am very aware that there are differences that occur as people get older biologically, and even if you want to continue to have a full and robust sexual relationship, there are challenges that are associated with that. So when you talk to people who are aging that are in a committed relationship but want to maintain the structure and the pleasure of that, what do you say to people?
That's a really great question. First and foremost, communication is so, as we've already talked about multiple times, is really, really important. And I would urge you guys to have date nights. Get to know each other again. And even with kids, I tell everyone you should have one night, whether it's every week or every other week or once a month, where it's just you and your partner going out without the kids. It's important to maintain that relationship, to grow together, and to remember that you are a person separate from mom or dad, right? And also, as we age, lubrication is going to become a thing, particularly for women who are going through menopause or who are coming out on the other side. Really understanding that and knowing that foreplay is very, very important. And have fun with it. Have fun figuring out, what does that look like to you?
So for lubrication, what do you recommend? Because her doctor was very much against water-based lubricants, and was more into either coconut oil or olive oil. And is that what you recommend?
100%. I love coconut oil. And here's a really great trick for those ladies out there who are listening, to get a melon ball scoop and to scoop out the coconut oil and freeze them. And then when you're wake up, or if you know that you want to have an intimate moment with your partner at some point, you can just insert that and your natural body will warm it up and you will have lubrication.
What?
Yeah, I know.
That is, okay, that's okay. Now, I have to ask this, okay, so is that not cold when it's inserted?
Well, sure.
Okay,
it's
but
fine.
you're saying
Part of the excitement.
It's part of the excitement, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Part of the thrill.
You have to frame it correctly.
Yeah.
It's always about the reframe.
Exactly.
You're totally right.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's just blowing my mind, because I would never have thought of that, but that actually makes perfect sense.
And it's wonderful, and it feels really natural. And oftentimes, sometimes with lubrication, it can kind of feel really unsexy.
Absolutely, right.
To be like, hold on a second, babe, let me do this thing.
Right.
But this is a way for, as women, we don't have to do that. It can just feel very natural on our own time. I inserted this an hour ago. We're good to go, babe.
No, that's fantastic to know. Okay, hopefully...
Just like some of the ED medicines for men. They can take them a half hour or more at a time.
And I mean, that obviously could be a whole nother show, is, the pharmaceutical industry that's
my
been
goodness. Yeah.
right pushed for men and has completely ignored women. And I know that you and Kathy are big advocates of understanding that women have just as much desire as men, and that there are things that can be done to enhance their
pleasure.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. So have you heard of the new drug for women? Adivay?
Yes, and she's not high on it. She doesn't think it does what they say that it will do, especially in terms of arousal and libido.
Right. I that is also my inclination as I hear. I was just curious. Yeah, interesting.
I play the village idiot on those podcasts. I don't know crap, but I'll ask her questions, and she knows all that stuff, so she just recites it.
So she must find your
idiocy.
I wasn't going to say that. I was going to say your contribution to be valuable.
Somebody always have to be the second banana.
Yeah.
Or the third.
Hey, I'm great with that. I like bananas.
So hopefully this was interesting for people. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please send those to us at the website, psychwithmike.com. You can follow the show on Twitter at psychwithmike, or like us on Facebook at psychwithmike. This was fantastic, Molly. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful to share space.
So the music that appears on Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.